Welcome, philosophers. Today we will discuss a great thinker by the name of Rabindranath Tagore. He was a poet, painter, playwright, composer, philosopher, educator, and the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. A man who seemed to carry an entire subcontinent in his heart, and yet spoke to the soul of every human being. Welcome to the Philosophy Zone. Let us walk, slowly, through the lanes of Jorasanko, the sprawling mansion in Calcutta, where Rabindranath was born on the 7th of May, 1861. The Tagore family home was no ordinary house. It was a palace of ideas. His father, Rabindranath, was a towering figure in the Brahmo Samaj, a reform movement that sought to strip Hinduism of its superstitions and return to a pure ethical monotheism. Imagine the young Rabindranath, barely 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on a marble floor while pandits argued about the nature of the divine, or listening to his elder brother play the piano as Beethoven mingled with ragas. This was a childhood steeped in contradiction. The strict discipline of a Brahmo household and the wild freedom of a mind that refused to be tamed. He hated school. Absolutely loathed it. The rigid classrooms, the rote learning, the British headmasters with their canes, and their contempt for anything Indian. By 13, he'd abandoned formal education altogether. Instead, he was tutored at home in Sanskrit, in astronomy, in the Upanishads, and in the poetry of Kalidasa. And he wrote. His first poem was published at 16, under a pseudonym, because even then he understood the weight of the family name. But let's linger on that moment. A boy barely shaving, sending his verses out into the world like paper boats on a monsoon stream. What courage! Now picture him at 17, sent to England to study law. Brighton, London, the grey skies, the gas lamps, the endless rain. He lasted a year, not because he was lazy, but because he was drowning in a culture that saw him as exotic, as other. He wrote letters home that ache with homesickness. The trees here have no soul, he said. They stand like sentinels, not like friends. And yet, something shifted in him there. He began to see Bengal not just as home, but as a civilization in dialogue with the world. The seeds of his universalism were planted in that cold English soil. Back in India, he was thrust into managing the family estates in East Bengal, now Bangladesh. This is where the magic happens. Imagine him on a houseboat, drifting down the Padma River at twilight. The water like molten gold, the call of coals, the villagers singing as they worked the fields. He wasn't just an absentee landlord, he lived among them. He learned their songs, their sorrows, their superstitions. And he wrote Gitanjali, song offerings, those luminous poems that would win him the Nobel in 1913. But let's read one, shall we? Not as an academic exercise, but as if we're whispering it to a friend across a candle-lit table, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Do you feel that? It's not just a prayer for India. It's a prayer for every soul trapped in dogma, in fear, in the petty tyrannies of the self. Tagore wasn't writing for a nation. He was writing for humanity. But he was no saint floating above the fray. He was a man of fierce contradictions. He adored the beauty of Hindu rituals, the lamps, the incense, the chanting, even as he rejected their orthodoxy. He dressed like a Victorian gentleman in his youth, then later wrapped himself in flowing robes like a sadhu. He founded a school, Shantiniketan, in 1901, a place where children learned under trees, where art and music were as important as mathematics. Yet he despaired when his own son failed to live up to his ideals. He loved women, deeply, complicatedly. There was his sister-in-law, Kadambari, who committed suicide when he was 22, a wound he never fully healed from. There was Victoria Ocampo, the Argentine writer 30 years later, who called him the cyclone from Bengal. He wrote her letters that burn with a tenderness just this side of transgression. And then there was politics. Tagore was knighted in 1915. He gave it back in 1919 after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The honour, he wrote to the Viceroy, has become meaningless to me. But he wasn't a nationalist in the way Gandhi was. He distrusted the mob, he feared the rise of fascism in Europe, and saw its shadow in India's own communal violence. Nationalism, he said, is a cruel epidemic of evil. He dreamed of a world where East and West met not as conqueror and conquered, but as lovers. Naive, perhaps. But tell me, when has cynicism ever built a school or written a song that makes strangers weep? Let's talk about his paintings. Yes, paintings. He started at 67 after a lifetime of doodling in the margins of his manuscripts. Birds with human eyes, women with rivers for hair, faces erased, as if identity itself were a distraction. He said, "I have painted because I could not help it." Over 2,000 works. Raw, strange, utterly original. Like his poetry, they seem to come from a place before language and music. He composed over 2,000 songs. Rabindranath Sangeet. They are the soundtrack of Bengal. Weddings, funerals, train journeys, a mother singing her child to sleep. The melodies are simple, but they carry the weight of centuries. He took Scottish ballads, Irish airs, Baul folk tunes, and wove them into something uniquely his own. Listen to Amar Sonar Bangla, now the national anthem of Bangladesh. It's a love song to a land, but also to the idea that beauty can survive even partition, even war. When the Bengal famine struck in 1943, he was 82, dying, and still he gave his last public speech, begging the British to release rice stocks. He died 2 months later, on the 7th of August, 1941. The war raged. Calcutta burned. But in Shantiniketan, the students sang his songs under the same trees he'd planted. What does Tagore mean to us now? In a world of algorithms and outrage, of borders and bombs, he reminds us that the human spirit is not a commodity, that education is not about jobs but about wonder, that poetry is not a luxury but a necessity, that to love one's country is not to hate another's, that the divine is not in temples or textbooks, but in the laughter of a child, in the silence between notes, in the courage to live free. Let me leave you with this. In 1930, Einstein visited Tagore at his school. They argued about truth and beauty. Einstein said truth was objective, independent of humanity. Tagore disagreed. Truth, he said, is realized through man. Beauty, he said, is what makes truth bearable. They never resolved it, but they parted as friends. Two giants speaking across cultures, across centuries. That is Tagore's gift. Not answers, but questions. Not dogma, but dialogue. Not a closed fist, but an open hand. So the next time you see a river at dusk, or hear a song you don't understand, but feel in your bones, or watch a child draw a bird with 3 wings, think of him, the boy from Jorasanko who never stopped running toward the horizon. The man who taught us that to be fully human is to be forever unfinished. That's it for today, friends. Tell us what philosopher you would like us to cover next, and we'll see you in the next one.